Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, strange, and sublime aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, or the go-to parent, aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Our podcast is just one of the many things we produce each week at the Company of Dads. We have various features, including the Lead Dad of the Week. We have our monthly meetups. We have a new resource library for all fathers. The one-stop shop for all of this is our newsletter, The Dad. So sign up today at thecompanyofdads.com/The Dad. Today, our guest is David Landman, a longtime human resources executive at Goldman Sachs. He now runs Elevate Work Advisory, which aims to bring more fulfillment, belonging, and connection to the workplace. He's also an advisor to Simper Barron's, an early-stage venture capital fund investing in technology, transforming healthcare, work, and financial wellness. David has a PhD in organizational psychology. He's a husband, and he's the father of two children, 10 and 13. David, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Good to be here, Paul. Thank you.
You know, there's always a tension between, what employers expect and employees want. Now that we're coming on, 4 years since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, what were some of the big disconnects that you saw at Goldman, while you were there? And I'm not actually nothing good or bad, but just like, when the expectations were not aligned, and how did you help, both sides, see the other person's point of view?
Maybe I'll start with something perhaps unexpected, which is now more than ever, employees want to believe that they're growing in their roles, that they're developing new skills, and prioritize personal and professional development more than the things that motivated people in the past, for example, compensation. So an important part of my role over the years at Goldman, I was leading much of what people experience across the talent lifecycle, was around figuring out how to reframe the different things that we were offering to the 45,000 employees of Goldman Sachs to help them actually feel like part of their reward or part of the employee value proposition was that they were going to come to Goldman, they were going to learn a ton of stuff, they were going to develop in both broad-based ways, but also bespoke ways that are unique to them. And that when they left or when they moved onto different jobs, they would leave better than when they came. And I think like from a disconnect perspective, I think a lot of people think, particularly in financial services, that people are there for the money. And I think there was a time that was, partially true. I'd say it's still true. People work really hard, in a lot of industries, including financial services. And part of the deal is you get paid for it. But money's not the only answer, particularly not with this generation, and helping people bridge the gap to figure out how to give people that perspective of growth that's going to keep them, and it's going to keep them performing well. To me, that was one of the disconnects that I had a good time trying to solve for. And it was interesting, having been in the workforce for 20 years, seeing the pivot of, it's all about comp promotions and moving up to, the broadening horizons of it's about a lot more than that.
Yeah. What was the moment when that changed? What was the moment, if you think of 20 years ago when you began at Goldman, what, if that was still the era of people focused on comp, you went to Goldman because they paid well, famous name. I mean, was it COVID that started changing it, or had it started to change before COVID, where people's expectations around what they expected from their time at work were evolving?
I think I like that term, evolving. I think it was actually a gradual evolution, but I think that COVID accelerated a lot of things, including people questioning what they were putting into work versus what they were getting out of work. And from my experience, that was the moment that accelerated, and actually, I think gave employees more power and voice in articulating what's really important to them and making decisions that perhaps they wouldn't have made otherwise to prioritize either things other than work or prioritize balance a lot more than perhaps previous generations did.
You're a former Goldman employee. It's not an advertisement for Goldman, but financial services in general, I've just got to be careful. Some listeners are going to hear this and say, "What is this guy talking about?" These people aren't going to work for Memorial Sloan Kettering, trying to cure cancer. These are not going to work for a nonprofit trying to feed the poor. When you think about but I also know from having been a journalist, a business journalist, there's tons of intellectual rigor that comes with working from financial services. There's tons of challenges that can happen. You're solving complex problems for companies, for people, what have you. But when you think about, when people would come to you in your role and say, I'm unsatisfied, with X, post COVID, what was X? What were the top 3 X's that they would say, I'm unsatisfied with? And how would you help them solve those things?
So post-COVID, I'd say it's work-life balance, return to office, that whole basket. I'd say it's learning and stretch assignments. And then lastly, I think it's career progression. And maybe I'll go in reverse order because I actually think it's easier to solve in reverse order. From a career progression perspective, look, I think, a lot of us work with a lot of high achieving people who are always looking for the next promotion, looking to feel rewarded and recognized, and getting a better understanding of what makes people feel appreciated. And that might be a title promotion, but it might just be, come join me in this meeting and present your work. It might be acknowledgement and recognition in a public way. Understanding what are those things that motivate people and make them feel recognized and like they're progressing. And in a very highly specific and targeted way, give that person what they need from a recognition perspective. So I think, in many cases that might be career progression and coaching that person and working with them both to help them demonstrate their core strengths, put them in the stretch opportunities that will enable them to thrive. And then also a lot of times it's about patience. It's around like, keep at it. It's going to happen if, you do A, B, and C. On the, stretch side, a lot of people now are looking for more frequent shifts in their roles than in the past and looking to experience a lot of different things across the workplace. And the last big thing that I did at Goldman for the organization was I built a new team that was specifically focused on helping to change the mindset, the technology, the scope of opportunities that people see when they think about how do I stretch and how do I progress in my role. And a lot of that was around trying to understand what skills people possessed and helping to match those skills as well as their aspirations to all different career paths in the organization. A lot of us in the HR field hear that people feel like it's easier to find a job outside their company than it is inside. And I think part of the reason is there's a lot of tools that make it very easy for you to see jobs and how they align to your skills, whether it's LinkedIn or otherwise, outside a company, and that stuff gets pushed to you. And internally, companies generally have not invested as much in internal mobility, but it's something that people really want now. They want that from a stretch perspective to help them develop. And I led a transformation, and we've invested a lot since then in helping people see that. And then lastly, the RTO debate and work-life balance and flexibility. Happy to dig into that one. That's at times that can be a tougher one to solve, particularly where managers have a different view than perhaps the executive team, the CEO, and what employees actually want and need. And that certainly for me in my 20 years at Goldman was one of the harder challenges, both personally as a working parent, but also as a manager and a leader, one of the harder challenges to bridge.
The first two you went into detail with, it seems to me it's a sort of resources, but it's really a communications issue. Like once you communicate that, yes, there is a possibility for you to be stretched. There is a possibility if you have some patience to move on. But in some ways, the return to office, work-life hybrid debate can seem, at least from the outside of an organization, as very binary. Some organizations are perfectly fine with you working hybrid. Some organizations are or not. We have all kinds of, sort of a continuum of, organizations that some of them have gone from, 2080 to 80/20 in terms of in office and remote, but again, tell me I'm wrong here. It seems to be really the sort of the provenance of the most senior leaders at a firm. If this is what they want, this is what's going to happen. If that happens to be the case, whether it's Goldman or another company, what is the employee to do? What is the employee to do if he or she is a great worker, but would like to work, not going to work any less hard, would just like to work 3 days in the office and 2 days remotely? We talk about working care shifts here at the company of dads, where there maybe is a dedicated 9 to 3:30 where they're working, and then they're returning emails at night or in the morning. What do they do if they want to work differently, but senior management says no, we need you all in the office 5 days a week?
I mean, look, I think the answer in the end is vote with their feet. And I hope that starts to happen. Look, I think the first step is having a conversation with your manager and figuring out kind of what can your manager do to help you bridge the gap between what you want and need and what the company policies are allowing. Look, I think people can advocate for themselves. I think people should be honest when they share feedback with their employer, whether it's in their employee feedback survey, which a lot of people are doing on a very regular basis now, or otherwise. But in the end, I actually don't think anything's going to change until people start voting with their feet, or actually not coming to begin with, and companies who are not being flexible starting to have a problem attracting great talent. I think it's the right of the executives also to decide how they want people to work. I think that they are misguided, and I think that they are thinking of it from their own unique lens. Particularly to get to the top, you need to be hard driving, work 24/7, but not everyone's like that, and that doesn't mean they're less valuable. And I think it's within their obvious rights to dictate those policies, but I think when they do over time, I think those who are being less flexible and being very binary around 5 days a week in the office, over time, I think it's going to erode the employee value proposition. And I think they're going to have a hard time attracting great talent.
One of the things you said that really resonated with me, and that, it's obviously leaders' right, but a lot of leaders look and say, hey, this is how I got here, and so therefore this is how you get here. Now, if anyone has even, skimmed a behavioral finance book, you'll know that that is, anchoring bias, that's confirmation bias. These are sort of, behavioral finance for dummies. They sort of walk through, why these are sort of detrimental to clear thinking. And I often think, like, because you started your career in the 80s or 90s and you've now gotten to the point where you're leading a company, you didn't get there the same way that the person who started his or her career in the 60s or 70s and was leading that company when you joined did. How do we help? I'm not one to blow up established companies. There's institutional memory. There's processes, there's a way of doing things. But obviously, startups are able. They don't have that baggage. Startups are able to say, okay, we're going to work this way. This is how we're going to operate. We may not, have the prestige. We may not have all the advancement opportunities. We may not be able to pay you as well, but you can work in a different way. Versus, boy, I've always wanted to work for fill in the blank. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, whatever, and they have a certain way of working. Is it going to take a sort of leadership change for these firms to think, okay, people can be as successful as I was 40 years ago working in a different way? Or is it really going to be, those top 30% of employees, as you well know from your all your various HR roles, they always have options. They have tons of options. Is it they're just going to have to go, and then in crisis, these firms are going to have to rethink what they're doing?
So I think it depends on the firm. I think for the more established institutions who have really dug their heels into this idea that work only happens in person, and creativity and mentorship and team building and all those things require you to be physically present, I think it's going to take time. And yes, I think it's going to, over time, take time for them to realize the effects of the policies they're setting today and how they're going to impact companies' ability to attract and retain talent. I also think as that time elapses, pressure from boards, pressure from other stakeholders, employees clearly voicing their preference and their needs, I think those things will also help move the needle in the right direction. But I think the change will come gradually. And we entered a period where the change happened immediately when COVID came to work remotely. It actually took a lot of time for CEOs to get people back into the office 5-ish days a week. They're still not in the office 5 days a week. But I think as we revert to whatever the happy medium is, my guess is it's going to take years. And I think it's going to take some kind of crisis of we can't deliver to our clients, we can't attract and retain the best people anymore. And now we have to pivot.
Let's pivot to your personal story. Your wife also worked at Goldman. You have 2 children. Think about your lives pre-pandemic and then your work lives post-pandemic. What were some of the ways that you were able to make 2 incredible careers work for yourselves, for your kids, for the company that employed both of you? How did you do that, and how did the sort of strategies you employ differ pre and post pandemic?
It was really hard. Look, I'll admit we over time developed strategies, but I'd say early on we kind of were figuring it out day by day, and it caused a lot of stress in our lives, particularly as we were both trying to manage our careers in a time that we were looking to continue to get more responsibility, to progress our own careers and climb the corporate ladder, while at the same time being really good parents. So I'd say early on, we did a lot of experimentation and landed on, I'd say, a few strategies that really made a difference for us. And, they're actually quite basic, but sometimes they take a little time to learn and how to adapt them and implement them for yourself. I'll share 3. One is calendaring. Mm-hmm. It used to be a daily discussion that sometimes led to an argument about who's doing drop-off and who's doing pickup, because we always knew that we had to split up those responsibilities.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, my wife said, this is silly. Let's, for a full month ahead, put in the calendar who's doing drop-off, who's doing pickup, and let's organize our schedules around that. And of course, it wasn't black and white. There were times that something important came up and we had to, ask each other to cover.
Yeah.
But setting a really firm calendar about who's doing what and when, that actually made a really big difference for us. So that's strategy number 1. The second one is, more broadly, division of labor. There are certain things that over time became my wife's department. So for example, she deals with school and camp. There are certain things that became my department. Finance, doctors and dentists. That was another thing that was my department. Very clear division of labor, but actually taking it a step further, one of your previous guests was talking about mental load. Mm-hmm. And it was really hard for both of us as very type A controlling people for the things that we delegated to each other to totally get that out of our mind and just know it's being taken care of. And even if it's not taken care of exactly how we wanted it to be, it still wasn't our responsibility to think about anymore. That actually made a big difference when we figured out that we just need to let go of certain things.
Yeah.
And then lastly, this is an interesting, I don't know if you call this a strategy, but being really transparent with our teams, with our bosses, this is the hardest one, about where our priorities were and what our responsibilities were. And it didn't always go as you'd want. I've had some really receptive managers and some much less so. But being transparent with my team, with managers, and also being a good role model for the other parents and helping to support each other as a parental community, that's something that really helped as well. There was somebody years ago, honestly, before this was as widely accepted as it is now, who was a very successful senior leader in my department. And when they came into my department and kind of shared some of their working styles, one of the things that she said was, at 5 o'clock, I walk out the door to get my kids, and it's non-negotiable. And she said, don't get in my way. Don't stop me to ask me a quick question. You can email me, but I'm leaving at 5 o'clock. And being transparent about that actually really helps both the team and helps the parent reduce at least some of that stress.
And I'd also argue that it helps people who would have reported in to that woman, because it was okay. She's modeling a work-life balance right here. She's modeling the way she's doing it, and perhaps I could do, the same thing.
Absolutely. And also not only modeling balance, but also modeling transparency. Like not feeling, there are some people who feel guilty or feel like they are choosing favorites if they say, I need to go take my son or daughter to a school event. And that means that they're not being loyal and committed to their work. That's obviously not true, but it's an insecurity that people have. And when you have senior successful people saying, sorry, I'm not going to that important meeting because this afternoon I'm volunteering in my child's classroom, that actually is, I think that role modeling aspect is super important. And it helps others, as you said, it helps others both feel comfortable, but also be more transparent about their lives outside of work, which then creates more connection between people, more understanding, and just creates a more open and welcoming environment for us to be in.
I mean, that transparency is key, and I think about that because, just like you said, like what's good for that individual person is good for that individual person, but the ripple effect that it has within the organization. I was guilty of this, when I was at the New York Times. I've told the story many times of sitting out in front of my daughter's ballet studio, and my dad had another daughter at the pediatrician. I was talking to a former cabinet official in the Clinton White House, and I didn't know what to do because the pediatrician started to call, and I didn't feel like I could tell her, hey, this is really important, I got to take this call. So I hung up, and then I mid sentence I hung up, and then I called and I kind of fumbled through it because I couldn't lie, and so I couldn't really lie. So I said, very sorry, bad cell phone reception in my town. Where we're in, super senior people, they just keep talking. They don't really need you there, so she just kept picking up. But is that it would be so different now? I would say, well, please hold on one second. I'll take this and I'll come back to you. The examples you've given though are examples of more senior people that resonated with you. If you are a person who is super good at his or her job, eager to advance, but happens to also be a human and has caregiving responsibilities, it's children, it's aging parents, it's a friend, and they want to be transparent, but they don't have the power of the managing director or the senior vice president. How do you, help them advocate for themselves? Like, what advice would you give them as like, here's an example of a good way to go about telling people that you are indeed a human and not just a worker? And what are some of the bad ways that you remember people going about, asking for things that, had they asked for them in a better way, would have been perfectly normal and acceptable?
I would start by telling them, and I've done this many times, they have more power than they think. If you have really good people on your team who are committed, they care about their work, they have built up institutional knowledge, as a manager and a leader, those people are extraordinarily valuable. And I always have said to people, I'd rather 80% of you than 100% of somebody else. And by the way, that it might be 50% sometimes, and it might be 120% other times. So I think starting with, I think we all have these insecurities and fears that if we say that we need to do something other than be fully committed to work, then we'll be written off as not committed. But that, as somebody who's managed hundreds of people over the years, it's so not true. We, as leaders, are so dependent on those great people, and honestly would bend over backwards. At least managers should. Let's just say good managers do bend over backwards to help make it work. So I would start with giving that person confidence that they're not asking for something unreasonable. In fact, them having an honest conversation with their manager, one that will help them be able to fulfill both their personal needs and their professional needs, is actually a good thing for all parties. And look, it's easy to say, it's harder to do, but as you do it in particular and get a good response, it becomes self-reinforcing. And then second thing is like, it's be honest. So many times I've had people skirt around like the real issue, or seeing people think that they're asking something, but in a very passive way. And it just didn't, it went over somebody's head. So I think being transparent, being honest, and being specific is also really useful. So it's getting up the bravery to say something. And then when you do, making sure that you're explicit enough that the person understands what you need. And then working with them and asking for feedback along the way, like figuring out how to make that thing work. And look, there's a lot that we can do to help managers engage in those conversations in the right way, take a longer term view of talent. But I do think, like, as a leader, as a manager, you don't know what people need unless they tell you. And you should be asking that question, but you need those people to come to the table with some level of candor and honesty, such that you know what they're asking for. For me, it was always like, what do you need? Like, tell me, let's work it out.
Right. But they need to feel that if they actually tell you what they need, that you'll be receptive to what they're saying and not say, well, we can't do that. Correct?
Totally. And that's, as an HR professional, that's part of, what we need to do to help managers, to help upskill managers, for them to have those conversations in the right way, such that not only does that one person feel that they're receptive and open and supportive and care about them, but also there's a ripple effect. You have one bad conversation with a direct report, they tell their friends, and very quickly you're labeled as somebody who doesn't care about supporting employees, and people are scared to talk to you.
Yeah. This is great, David. Tell us, what are you doing now? What's Elevate Work Advisory? Tell us, what you're doing to further the mission.
So look, you said it in the tee up. I spent 20 years at Goldman Sachs in a whole bunch of roles related to ultimately helping people feel more fulfilled in the workplace. And I decided, after 2 decades, it's time for me to scale that more broadly. So my mission, my purpose for being right now, is to support our progress towards a future of work that's more inclusive, that's more understanding, that helps each person feel like they belong and can thrive. And I'm doing it in a few different ways. One is by sharing my learnings over 20 years and hoping to inspire others. And the other way is by supporting the founders and the companies who are building products, technology solutions that actually help upskill the workforce, our managers, and solve the big problems that I was trying to solve when I was at Goldman. Because without great technology, we can't scale great solutions, and we can't help make the workplace better. And having sat on the buyer side for many years, having sat on the side of wishing things existed to help support ideas, I'm now happy to be able to give back to these companies and work with them to share perspective on product, on go-to-market strategy, make introductions as needed, and help them thrive. Because when these companies thrive, they're going to help ultimately employees thrive and help progress us towards a better way of working for everyone.
David, this has been great today. One last question coming out of that and what you're doing now. If there was a blank piece of paper and you could sort of design, the workplace or the company, culture that would best support employees, but also, make money, fulfill the mission of the company, do all the good things that a company needs to do to be a for-profit company, what would that look like? What are the, 3, 4, 5 things that you would make sure that, companies starting de novo would have to support its employees, but still be, profitable and be a going concern?
I think it's honestly like back to the basics and simple to say, but hard to execute. So I'd say the umbrella is we need more humanity in the workplace. We need we need a culture in which managers are more empathetic and know how to have conversations with their employees beyond just delegation. We also need managers who are able to deliver feedback and help people set their own goals, and then work with them to enable them to achieve those goals and beyond. To me, it's about humanity, empathy, and enablement. That creates connection, that creates belonging, and that inspires people. And when you have, those elements, that's actually what drives business performance in a much more sustainable and human-centered way. And for me, if I was going to design a culture, and look, I had a microcosm, at least in the teams that I managed at Goldman. That's the culture that I think we need to move towards. And that's what's going to create the next generation of workers and the right relationships between work, personal life, and your employer.
David Landman, thank you so much for being my guest today on the Company of Dads podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Thank you for listening to the Company of Dads podcast. I also want to thank the people who make this podcast and everything else that we do with the Company of Dads possible. Helder Mira, who is our audio producer. Lindsay Decker, who handles all of our social media. Terry Brennan, who's helping us with the newsletter and audience acquisition. Emily Servin, who is our web maestro. And of course, Evan Roosevelt, who is working side by side with me in many of the things that we do here at the Company of Dads. It's a great team, and we're just trying to bring you the best in fatherhood. Remember, the one-stop shop for everything is our newsletter, The Dad. Sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Thank you again for listening.